Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Clean Energy Transition Institute webinar. My name is Jamie Potasic. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm CETI's Communications Manager. I'm thrilled to see so many new and familiar faces here to learn more about our Net Zero Northwest Workforce State Analysis. Before we get underway, I want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Coast Salish people, which includes the Suquamish, Duwamish, and Stillaguamish tribes. I want to recognize and honor past and ongoing stewardship of these lands, and I also want to acknowledge their history of dispossession and forced removal, and respect their rights to sovereignty and self-determination. If you don't know whose land you're on, this resource we're dropping in the chat is a great tool. It isn't comprehensive, but it's a really good place to start. And I encourage you all to spend time learning more about the tribal sovereignty and treaty rights of those whose land you occupy and how you can actively support Indigenous communities. Before we dive into the data, a few notes on participating in this webinar. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom, we are recording this event, and a recording as well as the slide deck will be shared with you in a follow-up email, probably early next week. Katie McNabb, our Program and Development Assistant, will be sharing links and resources in the chat throughout the webinar, and you can navigate to the chat in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions as they arise, not the chat. So you can open up that Q&A function again by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but our team will also do our best to answer questions in the Q&A chat box as they come up. So no need to wait until the end to ask a question if you have one. A live transcription for this event can be turned on by clicking Show Captions and then View Full Transcript, again in that bottom toolbar on your screen. If you're having trouble finding any of these features, you might have to click the three little buttons, or it's like three dots that says More at the bottom right-hand corner, and then you should get more options. If you have any technical difficulties whatsoever, please email me at jamie@cleanenergytransition or chat me, and we will try to help you out. So for a quick preview of today's agenda, first, Eileen Quigley, our Executive Director, will talk about CETI and the Net Zero Northwest work more broadly. Then Ruby Moore-Bloom, our CETI Research Analyst, will dive into the results of our workforce state analysis. We'll end, as I mentioned, with a Q&A session to address as many questions as we can before our time comes to an end. And for Q&A, we are also joined by our CETI Research Fellow, Claire Buysse, and Mitch Schirch from BW Research to help answer questions. And then when the webinar concludes, you're going to be directed to a survey in your web browser that we would love for you to take a few minutes to fill out to help inform our future work. And I will now hand the mic over to Eileen, our Executive Director, to give some more grounding on CETI and our Net Zero Northwest work.
Good morning to all, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Eileen Quigley, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share the results of the Clean Energy Transition Institute's Net Zero Northwest Workforce State Analysis. We are very excited to have well over 100 people registering for this webinar. We still had people registering this morning. I am the founding executive director of the Clean Energy Transition Institute, and we are an independent, nonpartisan research and analysis nonprofit organization. Our mission is to accelerate an equitable clean energy transition in the Northwest. We provide neutral data analytics and best practices about decarbonization to enable fact-based conversations among stakeholders and policymakers about the smartest strategies, actions, and policies to pursue to decrease carbon emissions as swiftly and as equitably as the climate science tells us we must. We released the Net Zero Northwest Technical and Economic Pathways study on June 19, 2023. It provided energy pathways and health impacts analysis if the region were to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We followed the energy pathways and health study with a regional workforce analysis on November 15, 2023. Today, we are releasing the final phase of the Net Zero Northwest analyses, state-specific workforce data for Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. The reason why we undertook the Net Zero Northwest analysis was to provide current deep decarbonization pathways analysis for how the Northwest might achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But we were most focused on what the analysis could tell us about the actions required from now until 2035 that would put the region on the path to accelerate the clean energy transition equitably. We also wanted to understand how the Inflation Reduction Act might affect the costs of different decarbonization strategies and technologies. And we wanted to model the health impacts of reducing tailpipe and smokestack emissions, as well as the jobs lost or gained if the region were to transition to net zero emissions. The technical modeling underpinning the Energy Pathways study provided the input data for both the health impacts and the workforce analysis studies. Deep decarbonization is a systemic, economy-wide approach to removing emissions from all sectors of the economy. It does not just consider the electricity or the fuel sectors in isolation or for particular end uses. Instead, deep decarbonization examines the interactions of a diverse mix of energy sources across the electricity, buildings, transportation, and fuel sectors. This slide shows you the final results of the Net Zero Northwest Energy Pathways core case, modeling across the 5 intertwined pillars of deep decarbonization: energy efficiency, clean electricity, electrification, clean fuels, and carbon capture. When Ruby discusses the Net Zero Northwest workforce analysis state results, she will show how these energy pathway core findings informed the employment impacts. Here's where you can find the details about the Energy Pathways analysis, and Katie has been placing links to the work that I have been talking about in the chat along the way. You can also watch recordings of prior presentation on the Net Zero Northwest Energy Pathways analysis, as well as the webinar we held in November when we released the regional workforce findings. I will now pass the mic over to Ruby, who will present the state-specific Net Zero Northwest workforce analysis findings.
Great. Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Ruby Moore Bloom. I use she, her pronouns. And as Eileen said, I get to share some results from this latest analysis. So this technical analysis was developed by BW Research Partnership, a national applied research firm that analyzes economic and workforce data. And BW Research has produced the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, or the USER, for the DOE since 2016. So we were really lucky to get to partner with them for this project. For this analysis, BW Research examined the jobs that would be created or displaced if the Northwest were to achieve net zero emissions, as was modeled in the Energy Pathways analysis that Eileen talked about. You can see here the 4 sectors that are included, and like Eileen mentioned, many links in the chat for you to learn more. To start with some definitions for those of us who might not be familiar with this type of modeling. First, this analysis includes impacts on direct, indirect, and induced employment. So for example, if the Energy Pathways modeling showed a particular development of solar capacity, direct and indirect employment would refer to workers contributing to the development of that project over time, as well as the associated supply chain for component parts. Induced employment would refer to any jobs that could be supported in the local economy by those solar workers spending their wages. So for example, this could be a barista at a local cafe. And so induced employment is not energy employment per se, but it does point to broader economic impacts of energy investment in a local economy. And when we show the figures, we always indicate whether we're including direct, indirect, or if we're also including induced employment. So you can see that on every figure. BW Research also did analysis by industry category listed here, as well as occupation and wage tiers. So the industry categories are more of an economic development lens, so showing the impact of these energy investments on various industries. The occupation refers more to what the worker is actually doing on the job, and these can be more helpful when thinking about workforce development or training pathways. And then these wage tiers, they're based on the MIT Living Wage Calculator. And you can see they're slightly different ranges for each Northwest state based on different living circumstances. Before we get into the results from our analysis, I wanted to give a snapshot of what's been going on with clean energy jobs in the Northwest over the past several years. And here we are looking at data from that report I mentioned, the U.S. Energy and Employment Report. As noted in this small font source note under the figure, the clean energy data subset defined here is similar but not exactly consistent with our net zero Northwest workforce analysis. So it contributed to the data that we used for our baseline year, but don't try to compare these numbers exactly to that 2021 baseline year. But this still gives us a really good sense of the clean energy job trends over the past several years in the Northwest. And here we can see from 2017 through 2019, clean energy employment increasing in all 4 states, followed by a decline in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 2020 through 2022, again, we see steady employment growth, but mostly not enough to recoup these pandemic-related losses. In 2022, Idaho, shown here in green, is actually the only state with clean energy employment levels that were above its pre-pandemic levels within the clean energy job subset here. Similar to trends seen nationally, most of the clean energy jobs in the Northwest fall into the category of energy efficiency. And this ranges from about 65 to 82%, depending on the state, and then followed by renewable energy or renewable electric power generation or alternative transportation, again, depending on the state. Now to the results from our analysis, which again is showing projected demand for energy jobs if the region were on that path to net zero emissions by 2050. Overall, we found that a transition to net zero would support a 17% increase in energy employment in the Northwest by 2030. This figure here shows direct, indirect, and induced jobs, but the percentage is the same, even if induced jobs are excluded. As Eileen alluded to, we're more focused on the nearer term results. So in this presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about results through 2030, a little bit through 2035, even though the jobs modeling went through 2050. But uncertainty increases the farther out we get. And we wanted to focus on what would need to happen in the next several years to get us on that longer term path. In terms of this job growth that we're seeing here, you can see it is largely driven by increases in the building sector in yellow, as well as the electricity sector in green, slightly lesser extent driven by growth in the fuel sector in dark blue. Transportation on the bottom here, you can see is the largest employing sector of the 4. And it peaks slightly in 2025 when there's the most overlap between internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles. And then it comes down a little bit in 2030 when electric vehicles take over the vehicle stock. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in coming slides. We also found that an equitable clean energy transition is not just going to unfold on its own. It's not going to happen on its own. So it's really important to implement strategies that prioritize job quality and equity to make sure that this growth that we're seeing is not just growth of any job, but that these jobs are actually high quality. So now for some of the specific state key findings, again, looking just at growth between the baseline year and 2030. Idaho sees 22% growth in all 4 energy sectors, with the highest growth in these subsectors related to electricity and fuels, clean fuels. Montana sees 39% growth. Like Idaho, it has the highest growth in subsectors related to clean electricity and clean fuels. In Oregon, there's 12% growth. In Oregon, the highest growth is in subsectors related to buildings. So here we see commercial HVAC and residential shell, as well as clean electricity. And then in Washington, there is 14% growth, net job growth in all 4 energy sectors. And like Oregon, highest growth in subsectors related to buildings and electricity. This figure is showing us just the employment change from 2021 to 2030 by sector, listed here on the left. And then within each sector, you can see the states distinguished by those colors. So net change means that these numbers account for both the jobs that are lost, mainly in fossil fuel related subsectors, but then far exceeded by the growth in those renewable energy related subsectors on the path to net zero. For example, we can look at buildings to see how it divides up between the states. We can see that in the building sector, growth is dominated by Washington in darker blue and Oregon in lighter blue. In the electricity sector, it looks a little bit more evenly distributed among the states. And if we look at the absolute job numbers, Idaho in red and Montana in yellow are a little bit lower than Oregon and Washington, but the percentage growth is much higher because they start from lower baseline employment. So Montana, for example, we're seeing 118% growth in its electricity sector workforce between 2021 and 2030. Fuels, similarly, we see Montana dominating this growth, and we will get into why this is in some of the coming slides. So we're going to go through results sector by sector, starting with two of our demand side sectors, buildings and transportation. Here are the residential and commercial subsectors that are included in the building sector analysis. I think looking at the detail on these other categories is helpful because that's a vague word. This table is available on the web page. The link should be in the chat. I'm not going to read through in detail, but just to get a sense of what we're including in the analysis. The Energy Pathways analysis found that electrification is the most economic decarbonization pathway in many applications, and particularly in buildings. And so the modeling assumed really rapid and aggressive electrification of both residential and commercial gas appliances, and a transition to high efficiency building technology, as well as high efficiency building shells, all of which reach 100% sales by 2035. And so that timing in the Energy Pathways analysis impacts the timing of job growth that we see here. By 2030, all Northwest states experience net job growth in the building sector. And this growth ranges from about 21% to 27%. Within the building sector, all subsectors grow as energy efficiency and building electrification and retrofit efforts ramp up in both commercial and residential buildings. This transition to zero carbon buildings provides a significant opportunity, but also a challenge for workforce development to be able to meet this need. I'm going to take a look at a couple of the state-specific findings in more detail. So here, looking at Oregon and Washington's building sectors or subsectors. Oregon is on the left here with baseline employment shown in this green color, and then the change in employment through 2025 and through 2030 shown here, and Washington with the same figure. Job growth in Oregon and Washington's building sector is mostly in commercial HVAC. You can see those are the largest growth through 2030, and followed by residential shell. There's really significant job growth in these sectors, and by 2030, Washington's building sector employs more people than any other energy sector in that state. In terms of industry and occupation, we see the biggest growth in the construction industry, so this includes both new construction as well as retrofits, and installation and repair occupations. When we look at Idaho and Montana, job growth is a little more evenly distributed among the building subsectors. There's slightly more growth in residential shell than the others, and we can attribute this difference from Washington and Oregon's to the different building stock makeup in each state. In terms of industry and occupation, like Oregon and Washington, most of this job growth is falling into the construction industry and then the installation and repair occupations. Again, building electrification provides both an opportunity as well as a challenge for workers in the Northwest to meet this rising demand on the path to net zero. Since all subsectors experience job growth, there's less of a concern of displaced workers, but the region may still need updated apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs, construction trade union involvement, continuing education programs, and other curricula to ensure that workers are really prepared to install and maintain these newer, lower carbon versions of building technology and appliances. And it sometimes might be more about education than actual technical skills, because a contractor or an installer may have the technical know-how and ability to install a heat pump, for example, but could still benefit from education around when that happens. There's also different approaches for residential and commercial buildings. So for example, residential building work typically involves smaller retail-based workers, with really specific knowledge of these energy efficient technologies found in buildings and homes. Moving on to the second demand sector, this is transportation. Same as before, this table is available on the website. And in this analysis, transportation refers to on-road transportation only. So therefore, the transition is largely about switching from gas-powered internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles and associated charging station infrastructure. You can also see from this list of subsectors that this analysis does not include employment effects from activities like building highways, for example. So the transportation sector as a whole could be much broader, but this is our transportation energy workforce sector that we're talking about. And when we talk about conventional fueling stations a little bit later on, I just wanted to note this includes jobs like a service station attendant, as well as cashiers and retail managers at convenience stores that may be attached to a gas station. Transportation is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in the Northwest today, and the Energy Pathways analysis found that electrification of vehicle fleets results in significant cost savings relative to other net zero options. So like on the building side, the Energy Pathways modeling assumptions include pretty rapid and early and aggressive electrification measures, including 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2035 for light and medium duty passenger vehicles. So again, that timing has an impact on the jobs results that we're seeing here. By 2030, transportation employment increases by about 2% in both Idaho and Washington, and then decreases by about 1% in Oregon and Montana, as you can see in this figure here. These changes in transportation sector employment reflect the complexity of the vehicle stock transition, because there's projected job growth when large numbers of both internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles are on the road, but then projected job decline when the demand for conventional fueling station decreases and those jobs go down, as well as electric vehicles, which also require less maintenance, take over the vehicle stock. In the long term, so through 2050, this analysis shows that the region's transportation sector declines by nearly 16%. This is largely due to lost conventional fueling station jobs. But there's a lot of uncertainty around that transition and how dynamics would impact both existing gas station workers and future charging station workers. We do have a blog post from a couple months ago on this topic if you're interested in learning more, and it's definitely an evolving question. The transportation sector's transition must address the uncertainty surrounding conventional fueling station workers. And there are also additional concerns from auto workers about the impact of this transition on current high-quality union jobs in the sector. And this simultaneous employment increase and decrease within the sector really reflects the complexity of the transition and underscores the need of early and intentional planning. We should also take into account the geographic distribution of jobs. For example, in our analysis, we saw that Oregon has more of the production and manufacturing occupations within transportation. And so this is both an opportunity, but perhaps a challenge as well for that state's clean energy transition. So we just talked about two of the demand sectors, buildings and transportation, both of which show paths to net zero that are supported by early and aggressive electrification measures. And so now we're going to switch to the supply side, looking at electricity and fuels to see how the region's future energy demands might be met and what the workforce implications would be. Starting here with electricity, our Energy Pathways analysis found that economy-wide electricity demand would more than double between 2021 and 2050. Again, with that increased demand from things like electric vehicles and heat pump installations. And so we'll see that significant growth in electricity capacity reflected in these job results as well. Here are the subsectors included in the electricity sector. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can see that some subsectors are going to be growing renewable electricity subsectors, while others will see declining if they're related to fossil fuel electricity generation. I mentioned the dramatic increase in electricity demand found in the Energy Pathways analysis, and we can see that significant impact on jobs here in the figure as well. Net employment supported by the electricity increases by 43% in the Northwest as a whole by 2030. And you can see here the percentage, how they break down by state, with largest percentage growth in Idaho and Montana. As I mentioned, starting with lower baseline employment than Oregon and Washington. And you can see in 2030, they still have lower electricity employment, but really significant growth to get there. I wanted to show this map of the results from the Energy Pathways analysis to provide some more context for these job numbers. So here we're looking at electricity generation capacity from 2021, the baseline year, and then 2050 on the right. So these are, again, results from the Energy Pathways modeling. Decarbonization modeling suggests that a net zero emissions future would be a world where solar from the Southwest, so we can see this big proportions of yellow down here, offshore wind from California and Oregon, onshore wind from Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and more, potentially nuclear in Idaho and Utah, and hydro from the Northwest. These would all be on the grid at various times during the day. They would support a wide range of technologies, and they would provide clean electricity to power a much broader set of uses than is currently the case today. And in the Energy Pathways modeling, we see new capacity built wherever the best resources are located in terms of the technical potential. So that will impact where we see some of that electricity capacity being built. To take a more detailed look at Montana's electricity sector, in 2021, Montana's electricity sector employment is smaller than the other Northwest states. But by 2030, Montana experiences higher percentage growth than any other state. And this again reflects the Net Zero Northwest Energy Pathways results about that state's high quality wind resource potential. So that's why we're seeing this land-based wind growing so significantly by 2030. Most of the job growth in 2030 is in land-based wind, but we also see distribution and transmission to support that electricity capacity growing as well. In terms of the industry categories, all industry categories grow, and construction and manufacturing grow the most, actually more than doubling as investments spur this increase in construction activities supporting electricity distribution and transmission, as well as the installation of significant land-based wind capacity in the state. Simultaneously, jobs in fossil fuel-related electricity generation experience net decreases as renewables take over, and this points to the need for early and intentional planning for those workers and those communities. Moving over to Idaho's electricity sector, which also sees considerable growth of 81%, nearly 8,600 jobs by 2030, to support new renewable electricity generation capacity. In Idaho, it is also mainly land-based wind, as well as some nuclear, growth in nuclear jobs, and then the related transmission and distribution jobs. Like Montana, most of this growth is found in manufacturing and construction industries. In Oregon and Washington, there's also really significant electricity sector growth. Oregon sees high growth of 40%, dominated by land-based wind, transmission, and distribution. And Washington, which starts with a larger electricity sector workforce in the baseline year than any other Northwest state, also sees substantial net job growth of 24% by 2030, with the largest gains in distribution, nuclear, which would be small modular reactors, and transmission. Despite this enormous projected growth in demand, I don't want to lose the fact that the analysis also shows declining subsectors related to fossil fuel electricity generation. And even though these are relatively small numbers compared to the job growth, they are very real job numbers. When we think about how to prepare a future workforce for this significant growth in electricity demand, training efforts should be directed at the industries and occupations that grow the most, with the understanding that all of the industry and occupation categories are shown to grow quite significantly in this based on the increased demand for electricity in the region. Moving on to our last supply sector, which is fuels. Here are the subsectors included in the fuel sector. And of these, biofuels and hydrogen are the two alternative or clean fuel subsectors. And again, the link to find this table is in the chat. Today, the Northwest supplies 98% of its fuel demand with fossil fuels. Achieving net zero emissions by 2050 would require both decreasing the total amount of fuel needed throughout the economy and then lowering the carbon intensity of the rest of that fuel demand by producing alternative clean fuels. The Energy Pathways analysis found that after achieving these aggressive reductions into end-use fuel consumption with measures that we've already talked about, those energy efficiency, clean electricity, and electrification measures, there are still energy uses that are more difficult to decarbonize and therefore must rely on low carbon, liquid, and gaseous fuels. These end uses include really high temperature industrial processes, the need for drop-in fuels for things like aviation and maritime shipping. So the fuel sector therefore sees simultaneously job loss in fossil fuel subsectors and then significant job growth in clean fuel subsectors. Despite the displaced jobs in fossil fuel subsectors, the fuel sector as a whole supports a net increase in 3 of the 4 states, as shown here in this figure, with the most dramatic increase in Montana. I want to again ground us in some of the results from our Energy Pathways analysis. In this case, the results related to hydrogen, which is directly relevant to the conversation about clean fuels. So this figure that we're looking at is the results from the Energy Pathways analysis around hydrogen demand and hydrogen supply. So we're looking at demand on the top in the 4 states and then supply on the bottom. In our analysis, hydrogen can either be consumed locally into end uses, or it could be used in conversion to other fuels. This can happen through the Fischer-Tropsch process or the Haber-Bosch process, which produce Fischer-Tropsch liquids and ammonia, respectively. Fischer-Tropsch liquids are synthetic hydrocarbon fuels that can be used instead of fossil fuels in applications that I mentioned, like heavy-duty vehicles or aviation. And then ammonia can be used in maritime shipping. If not used locally, the hydrogen could also be exported elsewhere, as seen with these lighter bars of purple, which are showing hydrogen exports, and then the darker bars of purple are showing hydrogen imports. The Inflation Reduction Act, in particular, tax credits for hydrogen, renewables, and carbon capture. These all make investment in electrolyzers, which is the production method for producing green hydrogen, as well as the production of hydrogen and derived products like these clean fuels. The Inflation Reduction Act makes all of these methods more economic by 2030 in this analysis. And this is much earlier than in studies prior to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. I mentioned electrolyzers and this process, electrolysis. Production of hydrogen through electrolysis is extremely electricity intensive. And due to Montana's high quality renewable resources, largely that land-based wind we were talking about, the analysis shows co-located production of hydrogen and subsequent clean fuels with these renewable resources. So that's why here we see some significant production of hydrogen with electrolysis happening in Montana. Most of this hydrogen produced in Montana is exported to end uses in Washington, Oregon, as well as south to Wyoming and other places. And then Idaho acts as a pass-through hub to send hydrogen from Montana to those coastal states. So that's why in Idaho we see its supply is that it is importing hydrogen, and its demand is that it is exporting hydrogen, again, to those states like Washington and Oregon that have larger loads. In Washington and also Oregon, we see these Fischer-Tropsch liquids, which again, as I mentioned, are those synthetic hydrocarbon fuels. So this was a little bit of a deep dive into the Energy Pathways results, but I think helpful as context for some of these jobs numbers. With that context, we can look at the job impacts, starting with Idaho and Montana. So job growth supported by clean fuels, mostly hydrogen, as well as some biofuels, exceeds job decline in fossil fuel jobs from 2021 to 2030 in both Idaho and Montana. In Idaho, hydrogen adds over 1,800 jobs. Montana, hydrogen adds nearly 7,900 jobs, both from a baseline of 0. And there's growth in all industries, but mostly in manufacturing and construction in Montana, because that's where the hydrogen is actually being produced. And then in Idaho, there's a lot of growth in the other supply chain category, which includes transportation and distribution, which connects to the fact that Idaho is geographically in between Montana and Washington and Oregon. I wanted to take a bit of a closer look at Montana's fuel sector to see what's happening with that hydrogen employment. And this is an example of the level of detail available in some of our key findings reports, as well as the full reports documents that we have available on our website. So we're looking at Montana's fuel sector as a whole on the left here. You can see the hydrogen is in lighter green, really growing significantly 2030, 2035, and then dropping a little bit in 2040. On the right, we're just looking at the industry category breakout of that hydrogen fuel employment. So we can see what is contributing to that growth and then to that decline. In 2030 and 2035, we can see a lot of this growth is in the manufacturing industry, but then also in professional services and construction and other supply chain. All of these jobs are growing to support new clean fuels production facilities and infrastructure in Montana. And again, this timing is dictated by the Energy Pathways analysis. And within that analysis, it's dictated by emissions targets in 2030 and 2035 for the region. From 2035 to 2040, these hydrogen fuels jobs decline as the facilities are already up and running and as more end uses in the economy are electrified, and there is therefore less of a demand for clean fuels. But this 2030, 2035 time period, there is still really high demand for clean fuels because of the amount of time it takes to transition to electric or to electrify a lot of those end uses. In Oregon and Washington, the Energy Pathways analysis found that Oregon's clean fuel industry is projected to develop a bit later than the other Northwest states, and therefore job growth supported by Oregon's hydrogen and biofuel subsectors does not exceed its decline in fossil fuel jobs by 2030. In Oregon, clean fuels develop more in 2035, leading to some job growth in 2040, but Oregon's fuel sector still experiences net decreases in the long term through 2050. And this is partially due to different emissions targets. Washington has a more stringent emissions target in 2030, while Oregon's interim target is 2035. And these emissions target in the Energy Pathways analysis drive the need for clean fuel development. So we can see that biofuels jobs here in Washington grow pretty significantly by 2030. And in this analysis, the Fischer-Tropsch liquids, those synthetic hydrocarbon fuels, jobs related to that are captured in the biofuels subsector. And then for hydrogen fuels, we can see in Washington also significant growth by 2030, continued through 2035, but in Oregon, not starting until 2035 in that lighter blue. The Northwest is pretty unique in terms of the timing of its projected clean fuels development. It's earlier than other places, and therefore it may offer opportunities to make use of available skilled labor and to potentially mitigate negative impacts to displaced fossil fuel workers. This analysis did not include potential work opportunities supported by natural gas leak detection and repair work, so that could be additional. And there also may be potential transition opportunities with projects funded through the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub, which spans Washington, Oregon, and Montana. For example, the proposal from that hub included workforce commitments to include priority hiring programs for former coal industry workers, as well as investing more than $4 million into the Centralia College Training Center to provide worker training. So these are just some examples of potentially this transition happening. Resources should be allocated specifically toward training and transitioning displaced workers into new opportunities, such as the production, distribution, and storage of hydrogen and biofuels, but timing and magnitude and job location could all be challenging factors in this transition, which is a good segue into our last section about ensuring an equitable and just transition. I haven't talked yet about the wage tiers. So we found that the wage tier distribution did not change substantially between 2021 and 2030 in any Northwest state, with a significant proportion of workers earning less than a living wage in both the baseline year as well as 2030. So here are the percentage listed for each Northwest state. What percentage of workers are still falling into that lowest wage tier in 2030? They range from about 40 to 53% across the Northwest states. And this finding really underscores the fact that much more work is needed to ensure that clean energy jobs relating or resulting from this transition are high quality and family sustaining. This is also a good time to talk about a concern that sometimes comes up related to job quality. The immense increase in new renewable electricity, clean fuels capacity, and related activities requires a lot of building, as we've talked about, and the construction industry grows more than any other industry analyzed in this study. The short-term nature of these construction jobs, which can fluctuate with boom and bust cycles of development, raises legitimate concerns about the stability of employment in this industry. A potentially mitigating factor is that while each individual construction project may provide short-term work, the significant investment that the Energy Pathways analysis found in renewable energy and low-carbon building technology leads to a continued demand for construction jobs in the Northwest energy sectors all the way through 2050. Labor unions and private apprenticeship programs may also be able to help support stable workforce development for construction workers throughout this transition. Some specific strategies related to training workers and spreading economic benefits equitably are pre-apprenticeship programs, which can help bring people into the workforce from the economic sidelines, increasing access to community colleges and vocational programs, as well as community benefit plans. And then in terms of how to address job quality and wages, some strategies are labor union pathways, prevailing wage requirements, project labor agreements, and registered apprenticeships. But relevant registered apprenticeships we know are not available in all regions of the Northwest, which means that job seekers must leave their communities for training. So there's still more work to be done there as well. Achieving net zero emissions by 2050 in the Northwest will not be possible at the scale and pace that the climate crisis requires without significantly investing in equitably growing a clean energy workforce. But we first have to understand how demand for energy employment might shift over time in order to guide those strategies and investments that aim to ensure an equitable and just clean energy transition. And so we hope that this workforce analysis can add to this understanding. And we know that there's further research to be done, especially to better understand the current energy workforce development landscape in the region, and then to better understand what we need to do to get from where we currently are to where we think we need to go. This analysis is more directional and more top-down, and areas for future research would include getting a better sense of the reality of changing jobs on the ground. For example, a workforce needs assessment could help policymakers and other decision makers understand gaps, areas of greatest need, in order to guide these targeted workforce development strategies for the region. We invite you to explore the Net Zero Northwest website, and we'll actually look at it together real quick before opening it up to Q&A. I'm going to switch screens. Here we are. When you enter the Net Zero Northwest website, you see all of the results related to our energy pathways analysis, as well as the health impacts analysis, which we didn't talk a lot about today. And then all of the workforce results are available over here. I wanted to point out a cool feature of the figures on this site, which is how you can customize them to view results by state. So for example, if we are looking at this figure, which shows all of the subsectors, employment in 2021, and then change from 2021 to 2030, right now we're looking at the whole Northwest region, but I can choose a different state from this drop-down menu. I could choose Montana, and I would see that land-based wind really popping out, as well as the hydrogen fuels that we talked about. I could choose Washington and see, for example, the commercial HVAC workers really standing out. So this just allows you to see the results from each state in more detail and to kind of do side-by-side comparisons. All figures in the workforce analysis on the site have this option with the drop-down menu. This state analysis tab here is where you'll find a little bit of a summary of some of the results, and then you'll find all of the materials related to everything I just talked about. So for each state, we have a key findings report, we have a full results slide deck, and then there's a technical report prepared by BW Research, as well as raw output data from BW Research. And then finally, if you would like to get in touch, we have a contact us page. If you would like to request a state-specific briefing, you can do so through this form. And with that, I see a lot of activity in the chat and Q&A, so I'll hand it back over to Eileen.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Okay, so we were handling a couple of questions as we went, but there are 3 still in the chat, I think. Is that right? Okay. Jim's third question, there is an existing oil product pipeline in Yellowstone that's coming from Billings, Montana to Spokane and Moses Lake. Can that line be used to ship hydrogen-based liquid fuels, avoiding the need to build a new pipeline or use rail? This team doesn't know the answer to that question, but I'm super psyched to see it. So we're going to do what we can to find out the answer and talk to folks who understand a lot more about shipping hydrogen than we do. But that is, of course, wherever possible, if there are lines that have been created to ship or transport fossil fuels, and if they can be recommissioned for clean fuels, that would certainly be something that would be desirable. But as Monica is noting, it is good to produce, or best to try to produce the hydrogen on site where it will be used.
Could I add something on that, Eileen?
Yes, absolutely.
So in the Energy Pathways analysis, I think this is to the point that Monica just made, most of the hydrogen production in Montana is used on site to produce clean fuels like those Fischer-Tropsch liquids, which then those liquids themselves would be what's getting transported to the load centers rather than transporting hydrogen for Washington to make its own clean fuels. So I think there's both going on in the analysis, but I know that it was a more economic result from the analysis to have hydrogen being co-located with those renewables, but then also co-located with the actual clean fuels production, which is a lot easier and cheaper to ship.
Right. And then from our colleague McKenna, do we know the variables or assumptions that led to Montana and Idaho's hydrogen fuel sector rapid manufacturing growth by 2030 beyond the Pacific Northwest hydrogen hub and Washington, Montana? Ruby, I think you can take this one.
Yeah, and I actually don't, so I mentioned the hydrogen hub as a real example of something that's happening, but I don't think that the hub had any impact on the modeling because the announcement came out much later than the Energy Pathways analysis. What had a huge impact on the modeling was the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, and that made production of hydrogen a really economic solution for the region. In terms of where that happens, it's all based on the technical potential of resources. So Montana has the highest quality wind resources of the region, and that hydrogen production gets paired with those high quality wind resources. I think you asked specifically about manufacturing occupations. So that would be jobs related to getting those production facilities up and running. I could look into, if we have more detail, Mitch, and any of the background data on like specific occupations with like sub occupations within the manufacturing. But that's my understanding of both the geographic distribution, and then the timing is all based on Energy Pathways analysis and the need to meet these interim emissions targets that were in the analysis. So we used Oregon and Washington's emissions targets that are in the books, and then for the Northwest as a whole set interim targets, and then the net zero emissions target by 2050.
Biofuels from Adrian Gallo. Biofuels jobs similar to hydrogen had a boom in the 2030s, but an almost equal bust before 2050. What are the primary drivers of the bust? EV uptake, hydrogen penetration, tightening of emissions regulations, other. So this is probably a Claire, Ruby, or Mitch question. Who wants to go first?
It does make me want to look again at the data, which I will try to pull up. But I think that, yes, what you suggested. So, and I think I said this at one point, but as the transition to electric vehicles, as well as electric applications in industrial processes happens more fully through 2050, there's less of a need for fuel in the economy as a whole. And the need for fuel so early is about meeting emissions targets. The Northwest has a really, really clean electricity grid, and so we don't get a lot of emissions reductions from removing fossil fuels from our electricity grid the way that other regions of the country might. And so those emissions reductions have to come from the fuel sector. And so that's why we see that peak earlier on. And then, yes, as more end uses are electrified, there's less of a need for the fuel later on. The other reason would, I think, be related to more job growth in the years, like with construction and manufacturing, more job growth in the years of setting up the facilities and related infrastructure and production processes, and then some job decline when it's more about operations and maintenance of those facilities.
Yeah, that's my hunch, is that a lot of it is like construction phase versus operations phase, but would definitely want to look more into that. So we'll follow up with you on that. Thanks.
Okay. We have one that came into the chat, which I believe we only see, so I'm going to read this. We have large battery manufacturers setting up big factories, and this is from Monica Bromer. Big factories, in Moses Lake. Will any of those employees be added? Also, transmission is key to the growth of keeping manufacturers in state. Do you have plans for updating this information? So on the second question, in terms of the transmission, the Energy Pathways study is based on the Nature Conservancy's Power of Place data for transmission, and we actually ran a considerable number, what was it, I think 9 different scenarios, right, Ruby, on transmission. So we will, when we send out our written responses to the Q&A to all the participants, we can go into much greater detail with links on the transmission implications of the study and also the variety of ways we tested the impact of transmission growth. In terms of the updating, we do hope that we will be able to update the Net Zero Northwest results on a periodic basis. And the model is actually being updated right now for 2 other projects that we're doing in Oregon and Washington. So we will, in fact, have updated information this year, but it's not going to help us in terms of the transmission question. It's going to be a while before we would see that. On the battery manufacturing in Moses Lake, so I think I could let Mitch or Ruby answer this, but and I'll just let you answer it. I think I know what the answer is, but.
Well, we'll see if it's the same. I would just say that we are, definitely tracking that and very aware of that. And at this point, that seems like something that would come out of future work, like what I was saying about more of like a workforce needs assessment or some kind of a landscape ecosystem assessment of current training pathways and current, where current workforce, clean energy workforce activities are happening, which, like you mentioned, is not part of this analysis. So in terms of would they be added, I think it could either be through an updated Net Zero Northwest, which wouldn't be anytime super soon, but then more likely through that work that we're talking about doing, which is trying to get more real about what's happening on the ground right now.
Great. Also, I see that, okay, Adrian had a question that he put in the chat, not in the Q&A. So regarding the methane pipelines being repurposed for hydrogen, my understanding is that the materials are not compatible. The materials used for safe methane distribution are not safe for hydrogen usage. Some gas utilities are projecting costs for relining the gas lines for hydrogen lines, but it's prohibitively expensive. New lines will likely need to be built. And that is definitely our understanding too. And just thinking about it, one assumes that the pipeline is at the wellhead for the oil. And so I would imagine that there'd be all kinds of challenges in reusing. But again, this isn't our area of expertise, so we'll take that out to others who know if they're even looking at that. Okay. Let's see, where am I going back to? Mitch, did you have, I see Mitch had something you were going to answer. Oh, Mary. Oh, Mary's question. Is that the one you were going to answer, Mitch? Okay, Mary Kopriva, you mentioned uncertainty around the results a couple of times. Were you able to measure the uncertainty around these estimates in your analysis?
Yeah, so we don't have like a specific margin of error or anything for our projections. The reason being that we created those projected employment estimates using input-output models. So it's not like a statistical analysis. It's using like an accounting matrix. And so, yeah, that margin of error calculation isn't applicable. But for our baseline data, we do have margin of error calculated. That's detailed in the user data. I think that it was linked earlier, but I can follow up with another link. That's all in the methodology there. And then Eileen, for the clean energy job selection. So our baseline data from the user is defined by NAICS codes. We survey tens of thousands of employers all over the country every year for that. So we have a known sample of energy employers. And so we derive our employment estimates from there. And then for the occupational outputs that we provided, those are defined by SOC codes. They're grouped together, so I can provide a definitional mapping if you'd like, but yeah, exactly, NAICS codes and SOC codes. And I think the NAICS codes that are included in the user sample are available in like the user methodology, but I would definitely need to double check that. But thanks for your question.
I see that we have 1 minute. And so, Jamie, can we look at, try to answer Robert's question, or do we need to?
I think we can read it and acknowledge it, and I don't know how deep we can get, but we should. It's definitely very important and relevant to our work.
Okay. Does this report have much about impacts in urban versus rural settings? For example, one must wonder if the loss of jobs from the transition to EVs, i.e. gas stations, mechanics, etc., will more significantly impact small rural communities than urban ones. Also, many of the jobs will likely be centered in larger communities, leaving small towns wanting. So Ruby, definitely go ahead and answer this. I certainly have some thoughts, but I want you to.
Yes. Yeah. Where to start? We do a lot of work in other projects on the clean energy transition in rural areas. So this is a question that we think about a lot at CETI, how impacts of the clean energy transition look differently for different communities. In terms of the granularity of the data for the job projections, no, it does not get to the level of like county or region. It's at a state level, but we do have county level data from the user on the baseline side from the U.S. Energy and Employment Report. There are some maps that are included in each state's full report slide deck that show where the jobs are distributed. And so while the results from our analysis aren't at that county level, you can make some projections based on where the current jobs are. I don't know, Eileen, if you
The
would
only
wanna
other thing
add.
I would say is that the statement that many of the jobs will likely be centered in larger communities, leaving small towns wanting, I'm not quite sure that that is accurate based on what we're seeing. It could be quite the opposite, in fact.
In terms of where the higher quality renewable resources are.
Yes, and also if we are actually retrofitting all these buildings and if we are actually trying to convert, the heat pumps and all the rest, and we are doing it equitably and we are focusing on rural communities, then those are jobs that are better kept in the community and building that skill set in the community and developing the opportunities for all kinds of folks to get trained as HVAC operators and heat pump and all the rest, solar, etc. Okay, we went over, sorry about that. Okay, so thank you all so very much for joining us today. The recording of the webinar, the slide deck, the transcript of the Q&A, and the survey link will be shared in a follow-up email in the next few days. Please take a few minutes to fill out the survey that will appear in your browser when you exit so we can get feedback on our presentation and inform our future work. If you're interested in having state-specific briefings or presentations where we go deeper into the workforce results for a specific Northwest state, please request a briefing at the link in the chat. To stay up to date on our work, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. There's a link in the chat for that also. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us at CETI at any time with any questions you have about any of our work. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar today, and thank you to the fabulous team that put this together.